I would love to welcome back to the show economist and researcher Justin Wiltshire. He's had a multitude of studies published and his work shown from Vox to in front of Congress. And today we're going to be honing in and speaking on the economic impact of migrants after Hurricane Maria. But of course, I want to say first, thank you for joining us again.
Really happy to be here, Brandon. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, and we're happy to have you. Nice seeing you as well. So to start kind of, I guess, more broad or to just put in context what exactly we're talking about, could you kind of give us just what your study was looking into, and then also how it kind of differs from studies of the past, like with the boat lift study, for instance, whether it be the amount or type of migrants, what you looked into, that sort of thing?
Absolutely. So effectively, the context within which we approached this research was that in the past, when we've wanted to see what the impact of a large inflow of somewhat non-English speaking migrants into the United States, what effect that had on labor markets, often economists have used what is known as the Mariel boat lift. And this was all of these primarily Cuban migrants coming over very quickly from Cuba in the early 1980s. And the result of that has been kind of explored by several economists. David Card first looked at it using what's called a difference in differences study, where he selected a few what he thought were kind of comparable cities to Miami, which is where almost all of the Marielitos went, and then kind of estimated the effect of the arrival of these migrants on the Miami labor market. And that was, widely regarded as a very cool study. Some people disagreed, in particular, George Borjas, who tends to find, in general, more negative impacts of immigration in his research. And he looked using a synthetic control estimator, which I have done a lot of work with the previous time that I came on your show. It's talking about work with synthetic controls. And this one, I'm talking about work with synthetic controls. But he looked at the effect of the Marielitos and he said, oh, look, it was pretty negative. And then on the other side, Giovanni Perry, who is probably, along with George Borjas, they're the two really most well-known immigration economists in the world. Giovanni Perry was my advisor. He's an excellent researcher and a co-author on this study. He, with another author, used a synthetic control approach with Mariel boat lift and found actually there were no real negative impacts on the local workers. So there was kind of this body of research which was using the Mariel boat lift, but because it happened several decades ago, there were lots of concerns about how relevant it was to today and even about the quality of the data. So generally speaking, it was the CPS, current population survey data, different types of it, which is survey data, and it's relatively small. And when you're trying to capture even subgroups of the population, you run into all sorts of concerns about whether you're really you're getting a good sample or enough people to draw any conclusions. And in addition to that, when you're talking about the Marielitos, they were just not particularly well educated, and this happened, 4.5 decades ago. And so a lot of policy that may have been built on the studies that are looking at this really may not have been all that relevant. So what we wanted to do when we saw how awfully Hurricanes Irma and Maria devastated Puerto Rico, and we saw that Rick Scott, when he was governor of Florida, was saying that they were being overwhelmed with all these people coming in. We wanted to first see, well, what was the actual number of people that were going into Florida? Is Rick Scott, telling the truth or maybe not? And then what was the impact of those arrivals? Because Puerto Ricans, they are U.S. citizens, but they obviously, when they're in Puerto Rico, they don't get to vote for president properly. When they come to America, the mainland America, they can, and importantly, they have the right to work, unlike a lot of other predominantly Hispanic people. But they do not speak English in general very well. About a third of them speak English well. So this was kind of an interesting opportunity to look at the impact of this large inflow of Hispanic workers on a labor market. And so we did that. And we used the Freedom of Information request, looking at FEMA applications in the aftermath of those hurricanes. We found that nearly 20% of these Puerto Rican migrants actually went to Orlando. They were very concentrated in Orlando, to a lesser extent in Miami. And the reason for this was that there are already a lot of Puerto Ricans in Orlando and Miami. And as a portion of the population is less, but there are also a lot in New York City where a lot of these FEMA applications were found. And so we said, hey, that's pretty interesting. But Orlando, more than any other place, far more than any other place, clearly got a massive inflow of these people. But the Census Bureau estimated, unlike what Rick Scott said, where he said, I think over 300,000 people would come to Florida alone. No, actually, only about 124,000, not even, had left Puerto Rico. And we found about 24,000 of them ended up in Orlando. And, you know, possibly as much as 40 to 50,000 in total ended up in Florida. So, you know, fewer than were being claimed by the politicians at the time.
Just a bit, just a bit.
Just a bit, but still 24,000 people showing up into a city over the course of a few months. That is a major shock to a city. For Orlando, that was about 1% of its total population, about 2% of its employed labor force prior to the arrival. So this is, you know, pretty notable shock. You know, you're going to get suddenly a lot of people potentially looking for work, also looking to buy things, potentially looking for shelter. And so we wanted to see what the impact of that was. Long story short, we used a synthetic control estimator along with a few other estimators to check things. The idea of a synthetic control is that you're just matching on a whole bunch of pre-intervention characteristics, trying to find a weighted combination of a whole bunch of other similar places that really serves to act as essentially a counterfactual, we call it. It's the idea is that in the absence of this intervention, in this case, an inflow of Puerto Rican migrants, we would essentially see what we see in our synthetic control or in Orlando. But because we had this intervention, then we can say, oh, look, there was this difference. Let's see what the impact was. We looked and we found actually there was no negative impact on Native workers. Overall, there was actually a positive impact on Native workers' employment. And when we looked in several subsectors where we thought, okay, it might be relevant to look here, we found some really interesting effects. So first of all, almost all of these migrants, when they got jobs in Orlando, we found that they got jobs in the construction sector. And this makes a lot of sense, actually, because a lot of Hispanics already work in the construction sector. And importantly, you don't need to have great English skills to work in the construction sector. So, you know, if you're looking for a job right away and maybe you're working on your English, but it's not very good, you're going to go get a job where you can get a job where you can actually operate. And so that's the construction sector. We found a huge increase in employment in construction, 4%. We did find a negative impact on earnings in that construction sector, about 2.5%, especially Native worker earnings, which kind of makes sense. You know, you get a massive inflow of workers, then the employers can look around and say, I don't need to give you a raise, I can just hire that guy. So that makes some sense. And if that was the whole story, that would say, hey, look, you know, immigration hurts Native workers. But in fact, when we looked at other sectors where these immigrants were actually spending money because they needed to buy clothes, they needed to buy food, they needed shelter, etc. When we looked at the retail sector and at the hospitality sector, we actually found positive effects on earnings and on employment. And the idea there is that, well, because they're spending money, they're generating demand. And so the employers in those businesses have to say, whoa, okay, I've got all these new customers, I need to hire more people. And this generates positive spillovers on Native workers and also on less educated workers we looked at. So overall, we found that there was this positive impact with these subtle nuances going on. And it's a piece of this story that really isn't talked about much with immigration. You know, when people have in the past said, hey, immigrants are going to hurt my job prospects, it's a lot more complex than just saying like, hey, I'm going to be competing with these people. In fact, there are opportunities for people to win as well.
Yeah, and you kind of answered a bit of what my first question was going to be. It was going to be which sector saw the most inflow of these migrants. So I guess then the next question would be if in these sectors where we saw them, construction, retail, was it, I think healthcare was the other one you said, or health, was there any like, oh, hospitality. Yep. So I knew it wasn't age. I was close. So was there any like overcrowding of sorts in the employment? What was like the labor demand and supply? Did we see any like were native workers having their jobs taken, so to speak? Were they getting pushed out, or what were the effects we saw on the employment side?
Yeah, so we were specifically looking, this is a short run effect. So we looked 6 months and 12 months after the hurricanes, because this is really when we saw this inflow of workers and Puerto Ricans. After that, some of them started returning to Puerto Rico as the island started to recover a little bit. But when we looked, especially 12 months after the hurricane, so this is when the Puerto Ricans had been there for 9 to 12 months, what we found was that overall employment for non-Hispanic workers, or what we use as a proxy for native workers, this went up by nearly 1% without any negative impact on earnings. When we look in the different sectors, we don't see any significant, that statistically significant increase in employment in those three sectors: construction, retail, and hospitality. But our point estimates are all positive, giving us a lot of confidence that there really was no evidence of a negative effect.
Awesome. And I did want to get into wages too, but I had kind of a fun or silly question to ask, I guess, so to speak, before we got there. I don't know how much you keep up with American politics, or if you watch the debates or whatnot, or Trump's recent rallies, but one of his talking points recently has been that immigrants are taking Black jobs. Now, what Black jobs are, who knows? I'm assuming he means jobs worked by African Americans. So I just had to ask you, we had someone here who studied this. Was there anything shown in your data that backs up that claim?
We did not look specifically at the impact on Black workers, but I gotta say, I don't see any evidence of it. So, in general, Black workers do have slightly less education than the population as a whole. And something that we decided to do in this study was to look at the impact on less educated workers. And we really overall did not find negative effects. We found an increase of almost 1% of employment for less educated workers. Now, that was accompanied by an overall maybe marginally significant small decline in earnings. But that really could have come from just, this was not non-Hispanic workers. That could have been some of these Puerto Rican workers just coming in and taking whatever job they could get, even if it was at lower pay. We really don't see any evidence of this claim, which is, let's be honest, not all that surprising. Though, if the evidence was there, it would be important to see it, to find it.
Yeah,
I encourage the ex-president to maybe get some econometric skills and do an analysis himself.
Oh, I mean, Donald Trump analysis, that's a bit of an oxymoron, I think. But I did want to ask about the effects that you saw on lower educated workers, where they were negative. Were they statistically significant in terms of being negative? And then were they balanced out by other sectors where they were positive, or was it like, where was the net, I guess, level at?
Yeah, so I mean, I told you it was about a 1%, nearly 1% increase in employment for these workers, and that was statistically significant. When we looked at earnings, it really was sort of this marginal significance, if anything. We did see overall nearly 2% decline point estimate in earnings per worker, but again, marginally significant. That could have come from the arrival of these Puerto Rican workers into the workforce, and they were somewhat just a little bit less educated than native workers. And that's kind of borne out by the fact that in construction, the sector that really saw almost all of these workers come there, we see about a 1.5% decrease in earnings per worker. But again, marginally significant. It's kind of like, is it an effect? Maybe. But on the other side of things, we actually see in the retail sector a 1.2% increase in earnings. And the retail sector did not see any sort of disproportionate increase in Hispanic employment, suggesting these are native, less educated workers, potentially Black workers, that were actually seeing positive effects on their earnings. In hospitality, we also saw about a 1.3% increase, but again, this wasn't statistically significant. Overall, that story that we tell of, like maybe there's some competition with workers in the construction sector, but it's balanced out by positive effects in retail and hospitality. That's what we see here.
And then another part that you touched on that I thought was pretty significant to at least bring up and have you explain to people is the creation of new establishments or workplaces, essentially. Can you speak to whether more of these were created in the following month, which obviously, if they were, would provide more jobs and economic benefit for the cities absorbing these migrants?
Yeah, so we looked at the impact on the number of establishments because we thought, okay, first of all, maybe these new arrivals are entrepreneurs, and or secondly, maybe there's just some opportunity to invest in new businesses because there's all this new demand, because there are all these new workers. We found in all cases positive, what we call point estimates. That's just the estimated effect was positive in all cases. But we did not find that any of these effects were statistically significant. Really what that means is that we just weren't estimating these positive effects precisely enough. They weren't, given our data and maybe the length of our period, they weren't really able to show up brightly, to shine and say, hey, look at me, I'm a real effect. What we suspect is that in general, it takes a bit longer for what we call capital investments to happen. You want to start a new business, maybe you need to get the permits, you need to get your business license, you need to go to the bank, get a loan. And so it might take a little bit longer than 12 months to actually do that, but we're starting to see evidence of it here without it being statistically significant, which is really interesting to us that you would potentially be getting those positive impacts on the establishment side of things, because that would really only drive further gains in employment and earnings going forward, because that's just labor demand. Those employers, they're going to need workers.
Yeah. And I guess so, to just sum it up and make sure I'm getting it right and everyone watching is as well, it seems that the local economies were kind of able to absorb these new workers, the migrants, without having the pendulum swing really drastically either way, negative or positive.
Yeah, you got it. That's exactly it. Now,
So
the interesting thing I might say is that these workers, unlike a lot of workers who cross the southern border, they had the legal right to work. And, so if anything, they were providing more opportunity for direct competition with native workers right away. And even so, we don't see any evidence of negative effects, which is pretty interesting.
that is, yeah. I have another similar question to what I posed to you the last time we did an interview. Like I said then, I always like to ask people who have done research on a topic, this one. What was the most surprising finding that you found? It could be something you've already mentioned, and whether it be for yourself or you think maybe surprising to those listening who might not have been aware.
Yeah, I think probably the most surprising thing was that given almost all of these migrants went into the construction sector, that we only saw a 2.5% decline in average earnings, despite that massive increase in labor there. That really suggests that that wages are just not going to respond all that much to new migrant labor, even if you get a whole bunch of people.
Yeah, and I definitely agree. I interviewed, his name's escaping me, but I interviewed someone who authored a paper that showed that writ large, immigrants tend to work more as entrepreneurs than those in the workforce, which is another thing that was kind of surprising to me, and I feel like would be for most people as well. I did want to ask though, and again, this is a kind of indulging in personal opinion rather than data, but if by all accounts of your research that it seems these local economies are able to absorb these new workers and migrants without the pendulum really swinging either way drastically, why do you think that it's become such a polarizing issue, especially pushed by the right with the whole, taking your jobs kind of narrative and things like that?
I think it was politically expedient for that story to be there. Everyone wants a boogeyman when jobs are disappearing, when the skills of people, especially that don't have more than a high school education, when the opportunities for those people just are disappearing with globalization, just with demands things. I think people want to blame something or someone, and immigration is a good boogeyman. Now, I will say, I do think that there is some value in kind of evaluating how many migrants can be absorbed within a short period of time, or what policies would make places, individual cities, better able to absorb massive numbers of migrants. So obviously we're not finding any negative effect on the labor market, but these people have the right to work. I would argue that while the Biden administration has provided opportunities to work for hundreds of thousands of people crossing the southern border, especially Venezuelans, it would really be valuable to extend that right to work to all people crossing the southern border. In fact, all the people who crossed in the past who are undocumented and now don't have the right to work. Frankly, those people, they have fewer opportunities in the labor market, so they have to be willing to accept worse working conditions, maybe lower wages, and that could potentially provide some direct competition with native workers that drives down wages. We don't want that. We don't want those workers being in those crummy conditions, and we certainly don't want those workers unable to pay for their accommodations, for their food. I mean, local conditions, especially you look in places where migrants are being bused right now, it's made a lot of headlines. Local conditions can change in terms of the ability of a city to shelter new migrants. And if you kind of said, hey, you're actually allowed to work, you can earn some money and pay for a place, then that might actually provide more opportunity to those people and be less costly for cities. And if I may, just one more thing quickly, you could even tie the right to work with saying you have to be working in a particular city or a particular subset of cities, which would really provide an incentive for migrants to go to places where there are labor shortages and where maybe the shelter is not being overwhelmed. So there are all sorts of positive things you could do if you just granted people the right to work, which is what people want to do.
It seems your policy making acumen matches your research acumen. It's pretty good. I like some of those ideas you posed. I did have one more question that I did want to ask you. I wanted to save it for the end because I know it wasn't directly addressed in your research or the paper at least, so I didn't know if maybe it was outside the scope of your research or what you looked into. Were there any other economic factors you saw that were affected by migrants, whether it's I don't know, prices, for instance, anything like that? Were there any drastic swings in any of that? Is that something you even looked into, or?
Right. Yeah. So we didn't look at retail prices. We can imagine that if there was increased demand for retail goods, if wages are going up in those sectors to accommodate the demand, then potentially there would be some small increase in prices. But no, we didn't look, so I can't say anything on that. We did look at the impact on house prices because this was a question that we got when we were presenting this paper prior to its acceptance in the journal. And we didn't find any evidence at all that house prices increased, at least in this short run. And that seems pretty reasonable. Now, if you look in Canada, I think that there's some argument for at least rental prices being affected by the very large inflows of migrants into Canada in the last several years. But the argument to that would then be to say, hey, let's stop letting in predominantly high skill, highly educated people. Let's let in more people who are happy to take a job building houses. And, you know, in the United States, let's, as much as I love to hear, I don't know how serious he is, as much as I love to hear Trump making noises about wanting to grant a green card to everybody who gets a degree from a US university, I think that's, you know, potentially a good idea. You also want to make sure that you're not creating this imbalanced pool of migrant workers. You want to have all those people that are willing to work in construction jobs and able to help continue building the physical infrastructure of the country.
Yeah, and that is a good idea that Trump has posed, though I do think it's important to kind of take the things he says with a grain of salt, because, and another rally I heard, and I don't know if you heard this either, but he was speaking of like a fight club for migrants, and that would be a good idea. So
what?
yeah, he said this like verbatim in a speech, was like, we should have, I was talking to Dana White and I told him a migrant fight league would be a wonderful idea. And I was like, what are we doing? You don't want them to work, but you want them to like fight in a cage. Like, what is this? So it's like 20 bad ideas for any like semi good idea. And it's hard to know when he's just like trying to rally up his base and signal to them rather than put something forth actually.
Yeah, I don't really take anything he says too seriously. Unfortunately, when you've got a legitimate contender for the presidency, you want to know what might be coming down the pike. But yeah, let's no, don't do that.
Yeah, one of the worst ideas I think I've ever heard. Was there any other like maybe topics or points that I didn't ask you about that you wanted to bring up? We got to the end of my list of questions pretty fast, so I wanted to.
Yeah, no, as usual, this is a list of questions that were great, and I think it was really thorough. You're an awesome interviewer, so
I
yeah,
appreciate
thanks for
you.
the research.
Thank you. Yes, and you do likewise just as awesome research. So it's like a dynamic duo we got going on.
Love it. All
Yeah.
right.
Awesome. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And just like last time, hopefully in the future we could have you back on about another topic.
Awesome. Thanks, Brandon.
Yeah, see ya.